I'm Ray McGovern. I worked as an Army intelligence and infantry officer in the early 60s, and then I spent 27 years as an analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency. At the end of my career, I briefed the chief national security advisors, including the Vice-President of Ronald Reagan's first term in the 80s. The Vice-President was George H. and I briefed him personally. I started as a specialist on the Soviet Union. I had my advanced degree in Russian studies, and then later I had wider responsibilities. And when I was briefing the morning briefing to the National Security Advisor, the Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, my duties embraced the whole world. I didn't know everything about everything, but I knew people who knew almost everything about everything, and I relied on their backup for what I did. That's one of the effects of the neocon policies in starting the coup in Kiev on February 22, 2014. Now, the result, of course, was bitter relations between the United States and Russia, but also between Europe and Russia, because Europe decided to follow the U.S. lead. And when the U.S. decided to impose stronger sanctions on Russia, that was the day before a passenger plane was shot down over the Ukraine, and it only took 2 weeks before Europe, including Germany, joined the sanctions, and it was a miraculous thing that this kind of support came automatisch automatically from the downing of this plane, which was blamed on the Russians, but I don't believe that. Well, I believe that if the United States has intelligence, which I believe they have, and it supports what John Kerry said 3 days after the shoot-down, then they would certainly make that convincing evidence public. They know exactly what happened. I know enough about the intelligence collection capabilities of our government to know that they were focused laser-like on that part of the Ukraine. It is impossible, in my view, that U.S. intelligence doesn't know exactly who shot that plane down, and the reason they don't adduce those facts is because they don't square, they don't substantiate the charges made by John Kerry 3 days after the shooting. All I can say is that the initial charges against Russia and so-called pro-Russian separatists were very serious. They had consequences. Germany, others imposed sanctions. Okay? Kerry blamed it on the Russians and the pro-Russian camp. If he has beweis dafür, if he has proof of that, why doesn't he, after 1 year, show it? And I can only assume that the reason he doesn't show it, because it doesn't support his charges made 3 days after the shoot-down, just as the intelligence did not support the charges he made that Bashar al-Assad's government were responsible for the sarin gas attacks around Damascus on August 21st, 2013. Kerry likes to jump the gun, he likes to blacken the Russians, and that's sort of his modus operandi. But the fact that no one asks him to explain how he knew the Russians did it, he says, he said on Meet the Press that Sunday, 3 days after, he said, well, social media. Social media is an excellent tool. Well, I know that there are more reliable things than the social media. So that's my judgment on the shoot-down of that terrible plane where 298 people. It is a disgrace that the people directly involved, the Dutch, the Malaysians, the people who lost most people, don't insist that the truth come out. Why is where are the black boxes? I think that to the degree no one deals with the Russians, the neocons who have been running our policy are very happy. Now, the neocons lost out on Iran, okay? The president made the deal with Iran despite strong opposition from the neocons. So in this case, I think there's hope that the Ukraine can be solved in a more respectful, more reasonable way. And in answer to your question, yeah, I can't understand why the Germans, the French, and others let themselves be led down the garden path by intelligence based on social media. Mm-hmm. Well, all I can say is that I got that information from Victoria Nuland, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, who bragged at the end of 2013 that we had invested, as she put, $5 billion in Ukraine's aspirations toward the West. We also know that the Endowment for Democracy invested or had about 50 or 60 projects in Ukraine. The Endowment for Democracy, many people think, is sort of heir to the covert action arm of the CIA. And there's lots of evidence for that. So, yeah, it's very clear what was afoot. And one of the reasons they didn't like Mr. Putin is because Mr. Putin helped prevent a war on Syria. Mr. Obama was mousetrapped by those who wanted the U.S. to attack Syria overtly. Mr. Putin came in and said, if the problem is chemical weapons, no problem. We can get those destroyed. Obama said, you can? He said, yes, watch us. And they did. Now, the neocons were cheated out of their war on Syria. They were so angry that this added incentive to move against Putin. Putin's got the Sochi Olympics to worry about. They razzle up all these people in Poland and elsewhere, and they mount the demonstrations on the Maidan, and they have sharpshooters shooting both sides. We know that from intercepted messages, and there's a putsch. So most Western media begin the story in what I call the third inning, okay? That's a baseball term. That means the first inning is where it starts. The third inning is the third out of 9, okay? Now, they start the story halfway through, okay? The story starts on the 22nd, well, the story starts the first week of February when YouTube reveals that our Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs is talking to our ambassador in Kiev, and she's saying, okay, we've got things going now. Tell Klitschko to wait in the wings here. Yats is our guy. Yats is the guy, okay? Now, that was 2.5 weeks before the coup. And I wake up the day after the coup, namely the 23rd of February, and I hear on the radio, there's been a coup in Kiev, a putsch, okay? And there's a new prime minister, and his name is Yatsenyuk. So I write an article right away, and I say, yikes, this Yats, okay? Now, who's the prime minister now, a year and a half later? It's Yats, okay? So Yatsenyuk was our man. It's available in an intercepted conversation which Victoria Nuland admits was her voice. And the other thing she said, with all due respect to Victoria Nuland, when Jeffrey Pyatt, our ambassador in the Kiev, said, well, you know, the EU is trying to get involved here, she said, fuck the EU. And then she apologized for that. Now, if I were one of the European leaders, Angela Merkel, for example, I wouldn't take too kindly to the Assistant Secretary of State responsible for relations with Germany saying, fuck the EU. Israel has great influence in the American government. The new and good news is that despite that great influence, Obama and John Kerry, the Secretary of State, were able to prevail. They were able to close the deal with Iran despite great opposition, and that gives a lot of hope for the future. People say to me, don't you believe that Dick Cheney could have arranged, orchestrated 9/11? And I say, of course I do. But I don't do faith-based intelligence. It doesn't matter what I believe. It's the empirical facts that are important, okay? Now, there has been no good investigation. The one that was conducted by Hamilton and Kane was a cover-up, pure and simple. How do I know that? They said 4 years later in a book they wrote, we were not given enough time, we're not given enough money, we're not given enough access to sensitive material, we were set up to fail. Now, isn't that nice that they tell us 4 years after this big study comes out?